Welcome to Books in Brief, where we explore the key ideas of great books and how to understand them in everyday life.
Thank you for having me. Today, we are taking a deep dive into a subject that feels intensely personal to just about everyone listening. We are talking about creativity, but specifically, we are looking at the creative brain. Myths and Truths by Anna Abraham.
And this book it is essentially a demolition job, isn't it? I know I went into this deep dive thinking I knew a fair bit about how creativity works, the usual stuff about right-brain people versus left-brain people. But Anna Abraham basically takes a sledgehammer to all of it.
She really does. It is a highly corrective text. The central premise here is that we are all walking around with our heads full of what she calls neuromyths.
Neuromyths.
Right. These are these incredibly sticky, romanticized stories about brain function that feel completely true to us. And maybe they even have a tiny kernel of actual science in them, but fundamentally they are scientifically wrong.
The way she sets this up in the book is just fascinating to me, because she starts with history. Really to show just how gullible we as a society can be when it comes to biology. She talks about this concept of maternal impression.
Yes, that is the perfect primer for the rest of her arguments. For about 3 centuries, from the 1500s all the way to the late 1800s, it was accepted medical fact that a pregnant woman's imagination could physically shape her fetus.
Which just sounds wild to us now. The idea that if a pregnant woman was, say, startled by a rabbit, the baby would be born with a hair lip. Or if she craved strawberries, the baby would have a strawberry-shaped birthmark.
Exactly. It sounds exactly like folklore, but doctors fully believe this, and Abraham uses this to illustrate a major flaw in human cognition. We absolutely love simple cause and effect stories that link our behavior to our biology. We crave a direct line.
Because it makes the messy world feel predictable.
Precisely. And her core argument is that we haven't actually stopped doing this. We have just swapped out maternal impression for more modern-sounding things like right-brain creativity.
So let's get into that, because that is definitely the big one. The right brain myth. I feel like this is almost the horoscope of the modern corporate world. You take a test, and you are either a creative right-brainer or an analytical left-brainer. Where did this actually come from? Because the book points out that it started with real, legitimate science.
It did start with real science. It is heavily based on Roger Sperry's work in the mid-20th century. He actually won a Nobel Prize for it. He was studying patients who had undergone a corpus callosotomy.
Which is a pretty radical medical procedure, right?
Yeah.
That involves literally severing the bridge between the two halves of the brain.
Correct. Surgeons would cut the corpus callosum, which is this massive bundle of nerve fibers connecting the hemispheres, to stop severe epileptic seizures from spreading across the whole brain. And when researchers tested these split-brain patients afterward, they did find clear distinctions.
What kind of distinctions?
Well, they found that the left hemisphere was highly dominant for language and speech. Meanwhile, the right hemisphere was much better at spatial tasks and face recognition.
Okay, so the science itself was real. The left side handles language. The right side handles spatial reasoning and pictures. So why is it a myth to just say the right side is the creative side?
Because of what happened next in the cultural zeitgeist. That highly specific medical science got hijacked by pop culture. You really have to remember the context of the 1960s and 70s.
A counterculture movement.
Exactly. The counterculture movement was in full swing. There was this desperate, almost societal need to validate intuition and feeling against what they saw as the rigid, cold logic of the establishment.
So they essentially politicized brain anatomy.
They did. They took a medical finding about isolated functions in literally severed brains, and they turned it into a metaphor for human personality. Thinkers like Joseph Bogan decided the left brain was the propositional mind. Logical, boring, the oppressor. And the right brain was the appositional mind. Magical, artistic, the liberator.
But the book makes it incredibly clear that a healthy brain just doesn't work like a split brain.
Right. That is the critical error we make. In a healthy person, you, the listener sitting out there right now, your corpus callosum is intact. Your hemispheres are constantly talking to each other, millions of signals a second. In fact, Abraham argues that creativity is arguably the most whole brain activity you can possibly engage in. It absolutely requires the specialized skills of both sides working in concert.
She uses the Mozart example in The Creative Brain, Myths and Truths, which I thought was just brilliant, because we tend to think of classical music as pure feeling, right? pure right brain magic.
But think about what composing music actually entails. There's this famous anecdote that Mozart could compose entire pieces in his head while his wife read stories out loud to him.
Right.
But to actually write a symphony, you need the rigid mathematical structure of rhythm and pitch that relies heavily on the left hemisphere's processing abilities. You also need the emotional intuition and melody generation of the right hemisphere. You need working memory. You need fine motor planning to write the notes.
So if Mozart was just using his right brain, he would basically just be having a vague emotional experience. He wouldn't be writing a tangible score.
Exactly. He wouldn't be able to structure it or communicate it to the orchestra. The right brain myth persists because we humans just love dualities. We want the world to be art versus logic. But the brain is what Abraham calls an expansive throne. It doesn't segregate your imagination from your intellect.
I really like that image, the expansive throne. It feels much more empowering than just being told you're only capable of using half your head. But let's move on to the darker side of these myths, the mad genius.
Ah, the tortured artist. This is a tough one because it is deeply, deeply embedded in our biographies of famous people. Van Gogh, Sylvia Plath, Kurt Cobain. We have this pervasive cultural narrative that you have to be fundamentally unstable to be truly brilliant.
And Anna Abraham says, well, yes and no.
It is highly nuanced. She introduces the inverted U hypothesis. If you picture an upside-down letter U on a graph, on the horizontal axis at the bottom, you have psychopathology or mental instability. On the vertical axis, you have creativity.
Okay, I am picturing it.
On the far left of that curve, you have someone who is extremely rigid, hypersane, maybe too conforming to social rules. Their creativity tends to be very low. Now look at the far right of the curve. You have someone in full-blown psychosis, a complete detachment from reality. Surprisingly, their creativity is also very low.
Wait, low? I always thought psychosis was supposed to be this massive whirlwind of creative ideas.
It is a whirlwind of thoughts, yes, but it is entirely disorganized. If you are in a state of acute psychosis, your cognitive function is highly fragmented. You can't execute on those thoughts. You can't turn the internal chaos into a piece of art that communicates anything to anyone else. The sweet spot, the peak of that inverted U is right in the middle.
So the most creative people are the ones who are hovering near the edge but haven't actually fallen over it.
Precisely. It is often people who have schizotypal traits, which are mild, manageable versions of those symptoms, or people who are genetically related to those with severe mental illness, but who don't have the full-blown illness themselves.
This leads us to that fascinating concept she discusses called latent inhibition. I think this is the technical mechanism that actually explains the why behind the mad genius myth. Can you break latent inhibition down for us?
I'd love to. Think of your brain as having a very strict bouncer standing at the door of your conscious attention. This bouncer's only job is to keep out the useless information. The hum of your refrigerator, the exact pattern of the wallpaper, the physical sensation of your socks resting on your ankles. This filtering process is latent inhibition. It filters out the mundane stuff so you can focus on survival.
Right, because otherwise we would just be completely paralyzed by data all day long.
Correct. Now, both highly creative people and people prone to psychosis tend to have naturally low latent inhibition. The bouncer is asleep on the job, the filter is leaky, so they let a lot more of the world in. They actually notice the weird ambient sound, the odd color variation, or the hidden connection between two totally unrelated concepts.
So in both cases, they're being flooded with sensory information. What actually separates the creative genius from the person who is struggling and needs medical help?
The steering wheel. Abraham emphasizes a concept called top-down control. The highly creative brain has that leaky filter, so it gets the massive flood of unique data, but it also has a high-functioning executive control system. It can organize that data, evaluate it, and mold it into something useful.
And the brain experiencing psychosis lacks that top-down control.
Yes, they get the exact same flood, but they drown in it. The filter is wide open, but the steering wheel is broken. So the mad genius myth is actually quite dangerous because it implies the illness itself is the gift. The scientific reality is that the illness often fights directly against the gift by attacking that executive control mechanism.
That is a really crucial distinction to make. It stops us from romanticizing severe suffering. We really shouldn't be telling young artists to go off their medication just to write better poetry.
Absolutely not. The science strongly suggests that when the illness is treated and cognitive stability returns, the patient's ability to actually produce art often improves. Even if the raw, chaotic input dampens slightly, they regain the ability to execute.
Speaking of altering our brain chemistry to get ideas, we really have to talk about drugs, psychedelics. microdosing. It is this massive trend that just won't die. The ultimate Silicon Valley hack for unlocking creativity.
This is perhaps the biggest modern myth we face today. The pervasive idea that if I just take some psilocybin mushrooms or LSD, I will instantly unlock the secrets of the universe and invent the next massive tech platform.
But people swear by it. They report having these incredibly profound, life-changing experiences.
They absolutely have profound experiences, yes. But Abraham draws a very sharp line here. She separates the subjective feeling of being creative from the objective quality of the creative output. When researchers actually analyze the art or the business solutions produced while people are under the influence, the results are often remarkably underwhelming.
So I might genuinely think I have written the greatest song in human history while I am high, but then the next morning I look at the notepad and it is just total nonsense.
Very often, yes. The drugs drastically alter your judgment. They create what is known as a hyperassociative state. Everything feels deeply connected and everything feels universally profound. But without that top-down control we just talked about, you completely lose the ability to discern the good ideas from the terrible ones.
This ties perfectly into the book's chapter on dopamine, doesn't it? Because I think most of us generally get dopamine wrong, too. We just think of it as the pleasure molecule. You get a like on social media, you get a hit of dopamine, you feel happy.
That is the highly simplified pop science version. But Abraham explains in The Creative Brain, myths and truths, that dopamine is really about salience and value. It is not just a reward system, it is a neurological attention spotlight.
Salience. That is definitely a key term here. What does salience mean in this context?
Salience is essentially your brain saying, hey, pay attention to this right now. This specific thing is important.
Okay, that makes sense.
There is a really wonderful everyday example in the book involving coffee. Imagine you are sitting in a quiet cafe. You hear the sound of coffee being poured into a ceramic cup. For you or me, our dopamine system might simply tag that sound as reward incoming. We want the caffeine.
Right. I hear the glug-glug sound, and I perk up ready for my drink.
But for a professional sound engineer or a musician or a poet, their dopamine system might tag that exact same sound completely differently. It might tag the rhythmic cadence of the liquid or the subtle pitch change as the cup fills up. It tags those sensory details as salient, as interesting and intrinsically worthy of exploration.
So the creative brain is finding salience. It is finding high value in everyday things that the rest of us just filter out and ignore.
Exactly. Dopamine facilitates the experience of the unmundane in the mundane. Now, if we go back to drugs for a second, drugs artificially flood the entire system with dopamine. They force literally everything to feel intensely salient.
I see. So if I am on psychedelics, the woven pattern on the living room rug looks like the most important thing in the universe because my dopamine system is just screaming at me to look at it.
Precisely. It is false salience. You are overwhelmed with a sense of significance, but it is chemically induced, not intellectually earned. That is exactly why the brilliant insights almost always fade when the drug wears off. True sustainable creativity involves training your brain to find that salience while sober and then having the technical skill to execute on it.
Finding the unmundane in the mundane. I love that phrasing so much. Okay, I want to pivot to a section of the book that honestly sounded like science fiction to me at first. De novo creativity. This is the phenomenon where physical brain damage actually causes a sudden burst of creativity.
This is easily one of the strangest and most compelling sections of her research. It is quite rare, but there are well-documented medical cases. Usually it involves patients suffering from frontotemporal dementia or a very specific type of stroke.
And what actually happens to them? A formerly non-artistic accountant suddenly starts painting obsessive masterpieces.
Basically, yes. Someone who never picked up a paintbrush or showed any interest in the arts suddenly becomes obsessively compelled to paint or sculpt or play music. But the fascinating part is that it happens specifically when the neurological damage is isolated to the left anterior temporal lobe.
The left side again. The logical bully of the brain.
It brings us right back to that dynamic balance. The scientific theory behind this is called paradoxical functional facilitation. The general idea is that in a healthy human brain, the left hemisphere is somewhat dominant. It imposes the rules, the logic, the social norms. It actively inhibits the raw, chaotic sensory data coming from the right hemisphere.
Is the internal editor saying, don't say that out loud, it's weird, or don't draw that trees don't look like purple triangles?
Exactly. It is the tyranny of the left hemisphere. But when that specific area gets damaged by a stroke or dementia, the brakes are suddenly cut. the inhibition completely lifts. Suddenly, the person's brain is processing raw sensory information, vibrant colors, shapes, sounds, without any logical filter holding it back. And the result can be this massive outpouring of artistic production.
That is somewhat terrifying to think about, but also incredibly illuminating. It suggests the raw creativity was actually there all along, just suppressed by logic.
In a way, yes. It heavily suggests the capacity for raw sensory processing is inherent in all of us. But again, Abraham strongly warns us not to oversimplify this. These patients often produce art that is very visually striking, but it is often highly repetitive or completely lacking in deeper symbolic meaning. They have the right brain unleashed, sure, but they have lost the left brain structure. They have lost the expansive throne.
It really does keep coming back to that crucial balance. You absolutely need both. Which brings up the question of intelligence. I think we often conflate the idea of a genius with someone who just has a very high IQ. If I have an IQ of 160, am I automatically going to be more creative than someone with an IQ of 120?
You would logically think so, but the empirical data says no. This is known in psychology as the threshold theory.
The threshold theory, how does that work in practice?
It suggests that you absolutely need a certain baseline of intelligence to be highly creative. You need to be smart enough to manipulate complex information, learn difficult skills, and hold multiple abstract ideas in your head at once. The general scientific consensus is that this intelligence threshold sits right around an IQ of 120.
Which is quite bright. That is well above average.
It is, but the fascinating part is what happens once you pass that threshold. The correlation completely flatlines. A person with an IQ of 150 is not statistically likely to be any more creative than the person sitting at 120.
Why is that? What causes that disconnect?
Because standard IQ tests measure something called convergent thinking. They measure your ability to synthesize information to find the one single correct answer to a specific problem as efficiently as possible. Creativity, however, is primarily about divergent thinking, generating many possible unusual answers or identifying a brand new problem that no one else even sees. They are related cognitive cousins, but they are absolutely not the same skill.
So being a human calculator doesn't make you a visionary artist.
Exactly. They require different cognitive approaches.
We have time for one last myth, and this one feels very current to me. It is all about the default mode network. I hear about this constantly in modern productivity hacks online. People saying you have to activate your DMN.
This is essentially the new right brain myth. As neuroscience advances and we get better brain scanners, the popular myths just move to new, more complicated real estate. The default mode network, or DMN, is a network of brain regions that reliably activates when you aren't focused on any specific external task. It turns on when you are daydreaming, resting, or just zoning out.
Ah, the classic shower moment.
Right. And because we so often get our best ideas in the shower or while driving a familiar route, people have culturally decided the DMN is the magical seed of creativity. They think if they just zone out more often, they will automatically become creative geniuses.
But I am sensing a pretty big but coming here.
The but is that the DMN is only half of the cognitive story. The DMN is absolutely fantastic for generation. It throws up random associations from your deep memory. It is a powerful idea machine. But if you stay entirely in the DMN, you are just daydreaming. You are not actually creating anything tangible.
You eventually need to snap out of the daydream to actually write the idea down or build the prototype.
You need to actively engage the executive control network. The real scientific breakthrough that Abraham highlights here is that in highly creative people, you see something very unique on the brain scans. You see the DMN, the dreamer, and the executive network, the editor, active at the exact same time.
Which usually doesn't happen in a normal brain, right? Usually they toggle back and forth.
In most people, they are strictly anti-correlated. If one is turned on, the other is turned off. But the truly creative brain manages a delicate handshake between them. It can let the mind wander freely while simultaneously monitoring that wandering for something highly valuable and then instantly clamp down to capture it.
That is the real aha moment.
Yeah.
It is not just the idea randomly appearing. It is the immediate conscious recognition and capture of that idea before it floats away.
It is a highly dynamic switch, and I think that is the overarching lesson of Anna Abraham's entire book. Creativity is not a specific place in the brain. It is not a single isolated module. It is not a magic chemical. It is a highly dynamic state of whole brain communication.
It is the dance, not the dancer.
Beautifully put.
So, if we look at the creative brain, myths and truths as a whole, what is the one big takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with today?
I think it is that we really need to stop looking for a magic button. We desperately want creativity to be a simple switch. Just use your right brain, or just take this microdose, or just suffer for your art. But the neurological truth is so much more complex and demanding than that.
But also, in a way, much more hopeful.
I think so. The expansive throne concept means that true creativity uses absolutely everything you have. Your logic, your emotion, your memory, your sensory processing. It is the ultimate expression of human cognition because it requires the whole human being to participate.
It is incredibly messy, it takes real work, and you just can't shortcut it.
Which honestly makes me think about how we structure our everyday lives. If we really want to be creative, maybe we shouldn't be looking for a biological hack, but instead creating daily routines that actually encourage that handshake between our daydreaming mind and our focused mind. Give ourselves the space to wander, but the discipline to capture.
No shortcuts. Just the hard, incredibly fascinating work of getting your whole brain to talk to itself.
That is a fantastic place to leave it. A much-needed reality check for our creative minds. Indeed.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this brief exploration of the book, feel free to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel for future episodes. New book insights are coming soon. See you next time.